I mean, what does peace even look like for the collective West and controlled by Washington vis-a-vis Ukraine? I mean, what do they expect it to look like? Do they actually think they're going to push Russia back and have a beach party in Crimea? I mean, no, they don't really have a vision for what it looks like. They just can't accept reality at this point. And so there's going to have to be another administration for there to be a real shift and to at least slow the meat grinder down. And the nightmare is that Donald Trump comes in. This is the nightmare for NATO. This is why Biden faced so many questions in his press conference. Is you're not just threatening the future of democracy in this existential campaign in the United States. You're threatening the future of NATO. So there was talk at this NATO conference of Trump-proofing NATO, which is another deeply undemocratic mechanism for this global, or some would say globalist, war alliance. This is Jim Sciutto, our friend from CNN.
Feeling among senior NATO officials I've spoken with over the last several days is that anything that is agreed to here, stated, publicly advocated for, or otherwise, has a shelf life of about 4 months. The focus is on what the impact will be of the U.S. election in the fall. They look at the two options on the ballot as having a very different view of the U.S. role in this alliance, but also the U.S. role in the world, in Europe as relates to Russia, in Asia as relates to Taiwan and China. They are looking at this election as an inflection point. And I will tell you that I heard quite the same going up to several months ago, right, even prior to the presidential debate, as they saw an election that was at a minimum quite tight. Now, in the wake of that debate, many folks in this room now increasingly doubt the chances that President Biden is reelected. So they're bracing for the possibility of an enormous change in the U.S. role in this alliance. Now, you will hear different views as to how big that change will be, whether, for instance, Trump might attempt to pull the U.S. out of NATO or just reduce its role. But big change is coming. They see with this election. And that's why what you're seeing here really is a waiting game for what the effects of the election will be.
And I mean, that kind of foreshadows plotting against Donald Trump if he makes it into the White House from the transatlantic parties and countries and Brussels and I would assume London with Starmer in power, leaking all sorts of things and just initiating another kind of Russiagate like hoax about, Trump wanting to destroy NATO. But there's really no evidence that Donald Trump would ever withdraw from NATO. And he doesn't even seem to have the political latitude to do so within his own Trumpist camp. So it's all just like a bunch of hysteria.
What did Trump actually do when he was in office? He basically lectured other NATO members to spend more on their military, which the military-industrial complex was thrilled about. He pulled the U.S. out of really important nuclear arms control treaties with Russia, especially the INF treaty, which increased NATO's militarism, increased the possibility of deploying more missiles to Europe, which the Biden administration has just done and taken advantage of. So everything he did served a hegemonic, NATO-driven agenda. He presided over an expansion of NATO too. Like Trump, Biden loves to brag about how he expanded NATO and no one thought he could do it. Well, Trump did it too. I think under Trump, Montenegro was added and maybe somebody else too. So this whole scam that
North Macedonia,
it's like
all these fake little countries that were like aborted out of Yugoslavia.
Yeah, I mean, like this whole propaganda, campaign, it serves many purposes. One, it's there to make sure that Trump doesn't do anything to mess with the agenda, and that's what Russiagate was used for in part. So that was successful, and also it's used to take advantage of liberal fears of Trump in order to push a NATO agenda. So basically, if you make Trump synonymous with being anti-NATO, then you'll enlist liberals into supporting expanding NATO and expanding NATO militarism and using Ukraine for a proxy war to boost NATO, all those things. So it's worked very well for everybody, except the rest of us. Like it's worked for everybody involved in the scam, except for the rest of the world. It's been a disaster.
And then the disaster is increasing. I mean, Biden said in his press conference that he was talking to Putin, and Biden sort of started stammering or slurring, and it wasn't clear what Putin was saying, according to Biden. But I think Putin was talking about peace talks in Ukraine, and that the U.S. respect Russia's strategic depth and not advance NATO towards Russia's immediate frontier. And what Biden said was, you're talking about the Finlandization of Ukraine, and what you're going to get is the NATOization of Finland, which he said before, and he thinks that's some kind of zinger. But the Finlandization of Ukraine would have guaranteed for Ukraine the same peace and prosperity, relative prosperity, that Finland had been granted over the past 80 years after the war, as it maintained its neutrality with Russia, which is now gone, and 800 miles of Finnish border with Russia are now open for U.S. weapons and conflict. And the Finnish population now stands to suffer the same fate as, I don't know, the Japanese population and the Filipino population and the Guamanian population and populations all around the world who are part of this non-North Atlantic global war alliance. You look at the photo of the fools who were gathered in Washington under militarized police protection to separate them from the public. Just look at that photo of them under this disturbing logo, kind of like a star logo. Think about the anti-democratic nature of NATO and the goals that it has globally for constantly expanding and spreading war and subverting the authority, the popular and democratic authority of parliaments and legislatures. And then think about NATO's origins after the war and how it depended heavily on figures, how it welcomed and absorbed figures who had participated in Hitler's Nazi war machine, like Adolf Heisinger, who was a top NATO official who came into Western intelligence through the OSS and CIA as a member of the Gehlen network, Reinhard Gehlen's intelligence network, Reinhard Gehlen, who ran the Gestapo and then was taken in by the CIA, OSS, to run West Germany's BND intelligence network. What we're looking at now is not a defensive alliance against a Soviet or Russian threat. It's a kind of global regime, a kind of Fourth Reich that is dedicated to war and wiping out all enemies, that's supporting literal Nazis in Ukraine and genocidal fascist supremacists in Israel who are running concentration camps among the Palestinians, outsourcing the violence to these criminal death squads, and hiding behind the facade of liberalism and liberal democracy, which is just insidious. I think we're entering one of the most dangerous times definitely in our lifetime, because of this organization. And it was a little bit depressing that we didn't see the kind of protests against NATO in Washington that we've seen against the Biden administration's support for Israel's genocide or against Israel itself. I think people need to understand apartheid Israel is part of a much wider global network that's expanding and escalating.
You will unfortunately hear so many progressive dupes say things like, why can't we be consistent in our foreign policy? Just as we support Ukraine, why can't we support the Palestinians in Gaza? You know, people don't realize that Ukraine and Israel are part of the same system. They're both U.S. clients. Israel obviously is a far more influential client. Like, for example, Zelensky, the U.S. can tell to shut up and he will obey. Netanyahu will not just shut up when he's told, because he actually partly controls elements of the U.S. But still, structurally, the U.S. has proxies in both Israel and Ukraine, and they serve the same function. They serve U.S. hegemony. And even from the point of view of ethno-supremacy, there's a huge parallel between ethno-supremacy in Israel, which sees itself as superior to Palestinians, and the ethno-supremacists inside Ukraine, who the U.S. has been on side with since the end of the Second World War, which hates the Russian component of Ukraine and wants to wipe them out. And that's who the U.S. has sided with in Ukraine, especially since backing them in a coup of 2014. So there are parallels between Ukraine and Israel-Palestine, but a lot of progressives have been fooled to think that these are examples that are examples of U.S. inconsistency, when in fact they're totally consistent.
Yeah. The Nazis didn't go away. They just rebranded.